Yeah, thank you all for having me. What I want to talk to you today about is the craftsman analogy in Aristotle's biology, and specifically how he uses a metaphor or analogy between the craftsman and nature's actions in producing animals. And I want to do that to get clear on how Aristotle exactly understands teleological causation. And I want to argue that there isn't like one way that there's not one theory of Aristotle's teleology, but there's like multiple variations of it. And I'm going to show that by looking at two types of cases. So one case is the stereotypical prototype case of natural teleology in Aristotle, which is how nature designed, so presumably in embryogenesis, but he has a kind of thought experiment about that. And I also want to look a little bit at mistakes. So teleological failures, where things go wrong, but also where Aristotle says that nature himself made a mistake in doing something and then tried to correct it, and then see sort of where that takes us in the complete picture of Aristotle's teleology. So I want to start though by taking you to I gave you a handout like the old-fashioned person here. I want to take you to like one of the most beautiful texts in the whole Aristotelian corpus. This text one on your handout. So this is where Aristotle is trying to convince his students to study biology. Right, so in Aristotle's time, it's the natural philosophers are all looking up at the heavens, the skies, studying the planets and the stars. And Aristotle says, yeah, sure, the celestial bodies are the most divine, they're the most honorable beings. The knowledge that you can acquire of them is like of the highest kind. When you catch a glimpse of the planets floating around, it's like catching a glimpse of your loved one, immediately fills you with like, love and admiration and pleasure. All of that is true, but you can get the same kind of pleasure, a similar kind of pleasure too when you study animals. So it's true that they're less honorable. It's true that when you study biology, you have to cut them open. There's a lot of blood and gore going on, and not all animals are equally beautiful, aesthetically speaking. But for those of you who can understand functionality, for those who can see how all the parts of animals are there for the sake of something, they also get pleasure from that. So I want to give you like the second paragraph, that first text on your handout. For even in the study of the ones disagreeable to perception, Aristotle says, the nature that crafted them likewise provides extraordinary pleasures to those who are able to know their causes and are by nature philosophers. Surely it would be unreasonable and absurd for us to enjoy studying their representation on the grounds that we are at the same time studying the art that made them, which is painting or sculpture, while not prizing even more the study of things constituted by nature, at least when we can observe. So two things in that passage are important for me. One is that the good in nature, the pleasant in nature, the beautiful in nature is sort of replaced by functionality. So once you see functions, then you can get the same kind of pleasure that you would get otherwise from studying celestial animals. And the other thing that Aristotle seems to be suggesting here is that we can discover those functions, that we can see the functionality if we start thinking about nature itself as a kind of craftsman. So when you look at the painting of animals, you appreciate not just the painting itself, but you appreciate sort of the craft that went into producing that painting. And so the same thing happens when you look at natural animals. You have to look at them as if they are the creation of the craftsman, and then appreciate the art that went into them. Aristotle uses that sort of metaphor and analogy a lot. Sometimes it's just sort of innocent, like trying to explain things as a way of illustration. So text 2 is an example of that. But I want to look at cases where it goes sort of deeper, and where like Aristotle's using it as a kind of heuristic, like exactly doing the thing that he says here. Think of nature as a craftsman, because that is how we discover causation in nature. So when Aristotle introduces this imagery of nature as a craftsman, he's obviously not, that's not original to him. It's something that's already in the air, goes back to the pre-Socratics. Empedocles does it. The model that looms largest for him, Mo brought that up in her talk already too, is of course Plato. So I'm going to give you the caricature version of Plato. So Plato has cosmology, in which there's one divine being. Well, there's multiple gods, but the main divine being is the divine demiurge. He finds himself at the beginning of time with a pile of matter, unstructured and unorganized, and the models that are out there available to him as well. These are the forms. It's sort of not clear what exactly it means for the demiurge to look at the forms and then to create the earth and all the animals that come, that are on earth with it. Like, what do you see when you look at the form as a divine being? So the way I try to explain it to my undergrads is by this kind of analogy to me trying to put together an IKEA packet. If you've ever had that experience, like you get the nice leaflet that has a picture on the outside of what the thing is supposed to look like. That's your model or your form. I'm a very good person. I try to do my best, but I'm not perfect. And even more, there's the materials, when I get a packet of stuff. If you've ever put IKEA stuff together, those materials are not perfect. They're recalcitrant. That's what Plato says. So while I'm doing my best, the thing that I produce approximates somewhat the model. It's not going to be perfect. The closet that I put together will look different from the one that you put together, and that's partly because the materials we received were not exactly the same. My packet had a couple of missing, etc. But so for Plato, and this is sort of how I understand, like for Plato, you have very limited resources in trying to explain why things are the way they are, right? So you ask, why does the elephant look like this? And you say, well, the form of the elephant was like this, and this is this was the pile of matter that was used. And that's sort of all you have in terms of biology. Now, obviously, Plato was not very interested in this type of explanation. But Aristotle took that same sort of metaphor, the same kind of thought experiment, but it's no longer literal, right? We no longer have an actual moment in time at which nature created everything that exists. Nature becomes internal to every natural being. Itself has its own nature, what Aristotle calls formal nature, which, as I specified, it's like the internal efficient cause acting for the sake of something while following forms in accordance with formal cause. So you're giving some kind of specifications that you have to act in accordance with for the sake of realizing the thing that it's specified to. That's sort of at the very basic level what that looks like. Now, I'm going to say a little bit more of what form looks like for Aristotle, at least what I think form looks like for Aristotle. But at the moment, the designing of animals itself for him is more underdetermined than it is for Plato. So I'm going to argue that for Aristotle, what you get in the form is just a list of things to do. It's a list of vital and essential functions. And then nature, the role of nature becomes more of the graphic designer. That's sort of the imagery that I want to work with. And the benefit, I think, that yields you is that you get more explanatory power. You get a wider range of things that you can explain by working in that way. So a bit more about forms, because this is crucial. So as I mentioned, for Aristotle, the universe is eternal. All animal species have always existed. There's no evolution, there's no change. So the genotype, as it were, the form, is eternal, fixed, unchangeable. It gets replicated eternally from parent to offspring. No changes in that. But that does not mean that the phenotype, like what animals themselves look like, is already part of that form. So I think forms are thinner than that. So what I think they include is something like size, how big, it's kind of important, like how big is this thing supposed to be that you're making? It says something about whether it's blooded or non-blooded. That's an important category for Aristotle, like it has other things attached to it. And then importantly, it lists all the vital and essential functions. So by vital, I mean functions that the animal needs to perform in order to survive. So nutrition, production falls under that. And then essential are the kind of functions that make the animal the kind of being that it is. So swimming for fish, flying, birds, etc. But so within that list, like nature is not told, it's not predetermined how to then create that fish, or how to create that bird. Right, so you get a lot of room within the thought experiment to think about why nature made the fish that way and not the other way, or why the flamingo looks like this and the chicken looks like that. So it's up to nature, and according to this sort of metaphor or thought experiment, like what parts to make, how many parts to make, and what to do with extra material. So that part is going to be crucial, because I think that gives Eris a lot of extra range. And then this formal nature is working with a material nature. By that I mean the kind of chemical makeup of the animal, the kind of foods that it eats. So every animal has a kind of recipe. So Mo also already alluded to that. So some animals, the birds are all colder than mammals. They're earthier, and that explains in parts why they lay eggs instead of producing live offspring immediately, because they can't cook as well. So they need to make a shell to continue cooking outside of their body. Okay, so that's kind of the gist. And so material nature, what does that do? Well, it's conditionally necessitated, so it's shaped into particular shape for the sake of performing functions. So this is what you get on the Platonic picture too, like you grab your IKEA box and you try to shape it into the model that you already have there. It constrains the actions of formal natures. So Aristotle will say stuff like, nature wanted to make outer ears in birds, but it ran out of cartilage. So no cartilage, no outer ears, it just has holes now. Right? So there wasn't enough stuff in the box that I received from IKEA to make the extra handles. So that's the kind of story you get. And then material necessity also gives you extra opportunity. So that's the other thing that I'm going to talk about a little bit. All right, so that's all the background. All right, so now, so the traditional picture of teleology. So on the bottom level, the way Aristotle describes it, that's the definition that I put there on this slide. So formal natures realize pre-existing irreducible potentials for form through stages shaped by conditioned necessity. Now, I'll get back to this at the very end. Like, there's questions about how this bottoms out, what exactly it means. It's very unclear. The way Aristotle makes it clear, or indicates, or thinks about what is happening in normal cases of teleology is sort of by invoking this thought experiment. Imagine a hypothetical moment in time. Nature sits at its desk and is now asked to produce the chicken or the flamingo. There's no moment where it's producing bird, right? So it's always producing specific species of animals. So how does that work? Well, you get your form. The form specifies the vital and essential functions of the bird. So being a flyer, being an egg layer, et cetera, et cetera. Given that it has those functions, then nature has to figure out what kind of parts enable the animal to perform those functions. And Aristotle says nature can only use, within the thought experiment, nature can only use those parts that can be observed that actually have been used in nature on the ground. Right, so you have your table full of like your wings, your legs, your flippers, etc. And so you're like, oh, I need to make flyers. What am I going to use? Oh, wings. So that's next step. And then bottom step, well, I need to make wings. What kind of materials can I use? Well, they can't be heavy. They must be blah, 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 etc. So that's conditional necessity. And so now you're going to look at your pile of stuff. So for the bird pile, right, you get a certain kind of recipe of things. And then you need to use some of them to make the heart and the other parts to make the feathers. And so there's a bit of negotiation for what do you use for what. But all the causation in this model is sort of top down, if you understand it correctly. Like you have the form and it dictates all the way down how you're going to shape that animal. So in that respect, the heuristic is literally just telling us, like, it gives us the explanatory story, but then you can eliminate the metaphor once you're done with that. Like you've identified the functions, you don't need the metaphor anymore. But I don't think that exhausts the examples. So there are other cases where Aristotle appeals to different kinds of craft metaphor, more that of maybe a housekeeper, if you can call that a craft, it's a techne, I guess, or that of the architect. So as you're designing your animal, or as you're putting together your IKEA packet, in some cases, like one of the planks will break, or it comes with extra screws or bolts. There's an extra thing in your packet. So Aristotle thinks the same thing happens in nature. So you're putting together your chicken, and there's some extra stuff there. Perhaps because something else broke, or because you end up with more, or just because matter, once it's put together, it starts producing things on their own. And then nature has a choice, either to throw it out, throw it away, or it can use it for something good. And then Aristotle thinks that nature is a good housekeeper, right? She does not throw stuff out if she can use it. But in those cases, what determines its use is not the label. It's not something that was already specified in the form. It's rather the kind of potential that the extra materials have. And as it turns out for Aristotle, very often those extra materials are earthy. And earthy materials are hard, so they have defensive potential. Right? So for Aristotle, there's no survival of the fittest, and defense is sort of becomes a kind of add-on feature. It's not crucial. Species are eternal. Like this one dies, right? Nobody really cares. And so defense is an add-on feature in a way. And so Aristotle will say stuff like, well, in some animals, nature uses horn on the head, and some animals, like in the flamingo, it gets like slightly longer legs because it's useful. So that's one way of doing it. Another way that happens is that materials on their own start doing stuff. So imagine receiving a box of tiles for the bathroom, and the whole box falls on the floor and then breaks into a million pieces. And now you have a driveway that looks like a mosaic. But you can't use the tiles anymore for your bathroom, but nature will say, like, hey, let's just pour some concrete on it. So we got pretend it was intentional. So eyebrows and eyelashes are apparently like that. So stuff oozes out of material necessity. We have pores here, apparently no one knows why. And nature recognizes that those things are useful, and so it lets them grow. And so if you look at the text that I put on you, I'm realizing I'm doing a very bad job of pointing you to the text. I think it's text 9. But you see, Aristotle said, like, nature will just let the eyebrows grow there unless it needs to be redirected for some other purpose. So in this case, material necessity is doing all the work. Becoming to be is not for the sake of eyebrows, not for the sake of anything, but the presence is because nature decides, okay, actually, eyebrows look good. Let's keep them. So that's sort of the big picture for the two types of teleological causation that I think you can find in Aristotle. And now I want to look at states. So look at the complications and sort of the extra range of explanations that brings. So first, there are a whole range of teleological mistakes that are not due to nature, like stuff happens. Right? So one normal case, I'm talking about the type 1s here first. You have a teleological process and something greater interferes. Like you're trying to produce something, but it rains, or you drop the ball, whatever. What happens is you end up with a monstrosity. But something went wrong. You just had like a local farm with like a goat. It was a calf, I think, 2 heads. Like Aristotle knew about those cases. He would say that's like a monstrosity, like something just went wrong in the process. That's not a big deal. A whole category of beings he calls deformed types. So these are animals in which there's some systematic problem in the teleological process. This kind of odd. See, things of moles are an example. If you look at moles, they all have vestigial eyes still. And Aristotle's like, so they start growing eyes and then they stop. And it's like the case of the whole species of moles. So they're deformed. Like there's something weird in that species where teleology always goes wrong. The same for lobsters. He's very confused about the fact that some have bigger right arms and some have bigger left. Apparently they're handed. Lobsters are handed, which Aristotle didn't realize, but he's like, I can't tell why some of them have a bigger right arm and why some of them have a bigger left arm. There's no pattern to it. It must be a deformation. So again, like if you ask Plato, why is this the case. Like, I don't know if Plato would have something else to say apart from, well, here's the form of the lobster and different material. Like, that's sort of the extent where Plato can take it. And so Aristotle clearly has a bit more to say to that. Another big example is sexual differentiation. So all females, according to Aristotle, are teleological failures. But they're teleological failures of the secondary type. So Aristotle here uses the metaphor of baking. So the cooking baker analogy is relevant here. So when you're reproducing, you need material, the menses, the dough. You also need heat, the structure, and bake your goods. So that's what the pneuma and the vital heat that are transmitted via the male semen are doing. And so you get the kind of oven analogy where the male is the oven, male is the dough. If the heat is too hot, obviously burn the bread and nothing is a monstrosity. If the menses are too watery, floppy, and the heat is not enough, then you end up with a mess. Also, nothing happens. You have the perfect heat and the perfect dough, and you get a perfect dough that's like crispy on the outside, like fluffy on the inside. And then you have cases where things are just sort of in between, right? So the heat is not quite hot enough. The dough is not quite of the perfect consistency. And what comes out, is edible. You're not going to throw it out because it's edible, but you wouldn't serve it to your guests, something like that. And so the same thing happens in nature. Like women come out, they're shorter, slightly chubbier in certain parts. They're not as smart as the male version. So, but you're not going to throw them out, right? So nature says, well, let's use them for reproductive, like they can carry the babies. So we use them for something good, right? So, but again, like relative to Plato, what does Plato have to say? Well, first generation of humans are all men. Once they start messing up in their first life, they reincarnate as women, and if they mess up further, they come, the more you mess up, the lower down the tree you come. So that's also not a terribly great explanation. Another interesting case, I think, is a type 2. So these are cases where Aristotle looks at the animal and says, well, nature did the best it could. Like, nature truly did active teleological, but you can tell that the outcome is suboptimal. Like, it's just not great. And so the example of these are cases like the ostrich, the seal, the bat. And so for Aristotle, all of these animals are so-called dualizers, so they have two natures. So in these cases, nature was handed two to-do lists. So the seal says make a land animal and make a water animal. And then nature has to sit there and go, like, how do I combine these two design demands into one animal? Well, I do that by giving the seal legs because it's a land animal, but I make them look like flippers. It has to be able to swim in the water. So relative to land animals, seals, look at those feet, they're cute, but it's not very useful for walking. Like, they're deformed relative to the land animal. So again, you have a whole category of animal where it looks like, the ostrich, like, wings but can't fly. Like, what's up with that? So again, I think this is adding sort of explanatory power to Aristotle's system. Now, the cases I'm really interested in involve nature making mistakes. So the first example takes a little bit of setup. Because in these cases, it looks like nature is violating teleological principles for Aristotle are generalizations over what he sees nature doing always, for the most part. So they're inferences, right? They're principles that are deductively postulated. But within the thought experiment, he then uses those principles as kind of guidelines for nature. So it's like nature sits at its desk. So you have the form that says make a flyer, make an egg layer, blah, blah. And then here's the rule book that says, don't make anything in vain. When you put parts somewhere, put parts always in the most honorable positions, which is up, right, front. So those are your rule book. And so for the most part, nature follows those rules. So I give a couple of examples for the never do anything in vain case. So in the case of the the to-do list says make a blooded land dweller of this particular size. And so in most cases, when you're making land dwellers that are blooded, Aristotle knows you have four parts, four appendages where you stick on limbs, and that's how you make them locomote. Right? You make your cow, 4 feet. You make a dog, 4 feet. Now you're going to make your snake, same instruction. Here are your 4 feet. You're going to stick them in the middle. It doesn't quite work. You stick them at the back, at the front. Also doesn't quite work. And nature goes, well, it doesn't work, right? Let the snake just slither around. And nature removed the feet from the design of the snake. That's literally how Aristotle puts it. So this is very interesting, right? So rule is nature does nothing in vain. Looks like the part would have been in vain in this particular animal. So nature took it away. Same thing apparently with the sideways motion of the jaw in crocodiles. So every time nature makes jaws, they can go up and down and sideways, but in the crocodile, nature realized sideways motion. I'm not sure why, but decided it was going to be useful, and so nature just took it away. And then with the parts, so one funny example is hair. So you've created your creature, now you have a pile of hair still on your desk. And now nature has to decide, like, where do I stick it? Parts go, in the most honorable position, unless something greater interferes. So in the case of cats, they need more protection on the outside than they do on their belly the way they walk. So you're supposed to put more hair on their backs, fewer on their belly. But humans, because they walk upright, clearly he's thinking of male humans in most of these cases. They don't have a greater need of protection in the front than they do in the back. So you can put hair in the most honorable position, so they get chest hair. So that's a normal case. Now here, a case that complicates. I think Aristotle just goes off the deep end, trying to preserve teleological explanation. So back to horns. So I've mentioned before, horns are an example of the teleology that I mentioned before. They're made of extra earthy materials that nature could use for something else, or potentially could throw away if it doesn't find a good use for it. Aristotle actually says nature produces horns in those able to use it. So which means mostly in male animals, which explains why in the animal kingdom you see horns mainly on the male animals, not females, stops. But then we also get a whole passage, that's text 24, where Aristotle talks about how in some animals the horns are useless, and then nature had to compensate for that by giving them extra modes of defense. So you have the deer. They were given swiftness because their horns are useless. Antelope and gazelle also swiftness. The bison is the funniest of them all. He was given the emission of excrement, so it can throw around poop and swings it around with tail. And that's an extra mode of defense because the horns are not useful for that. And you might, why not take those damn horns away if they're that useless? Right, that was one of the options. And indeed, we get a different text that says, like, in the females, nature removed them. In the same way that nature removed the feet from the snake, it could have removed the antlers from the deer, right? I mean, obviously, the problem for Aristotle is that what he has to explain is the way animals actually, in fact, are. And then has to reason his way back. But he could have said something like, this is just due to material necessity and the nature has to make up for it. But no, he insists that the whole thing is teleological. And Gunnar mentioned Euphrastus earlier today. And Euphrastus, like the male nipples and the horns, like those are his main, like clearly Aristotle just insisted too much on giving them teleological explanation. And one more example. This is the clearest example where Aristotle says like, nature actually messed up. So this has to do with the epiglottis. So you have two pipes going down from your mouth to your lower regions. So the windpipe connects your mouth and nostrils to your lungs, and then the windpipe itself, according to Aristotle, also function, namely to cool down the air from the outside to the inside. the respiration itself is a mode of cooling. So that's one pipe that needs to go in here. The other one is the esophagus, so connecting the mouth to the stomach. Now, Aristotle's pretty down on the function of the esophagus, and he says, well, basically, the only reason we need it is because we couldn't put the mouth and the stomach right, on top of each other. Like, we needed to make some space between it, and that's mainly because the stomach produces all those fumes, and if the fumes get too close to the heart, messes up your thinking and perception, etc. But it's true. But so the esophagus does not perform any function at all, apart from just allowing for food to come through. So that's the crucial distinction. So now, nature is producing the animal. It has these two pipes, it's like this one in the front or that one in the front. And so here, Aristotle insists that what nature did is put the most honorable in the front. Windpipe in the front, esophagus in the back. Now you have a problem. Because your food needs to be shoveled over your windpipe, and then you choke. So Aristotle says, well, nature messed up, and then it had to doctor up. Like the language is actually medical in that passage. It's like nature, like it's as if nature already created the animal and then went, what can I do? I cannot switch those things around anymore. So let's just produce a lid that I can put over the windpipe. And that's how nature created the epiglottis. Again, it's like I'm not sure what Plato would do with this problem, but Aristotle is clearly pushing and trying to keep the teleology in there as much as he can. What he could have done here in this case, maybe more easily than the previous one, is to say the ordering of these two pipes happened as necessity. There was just no other way to do it. And then the teleology could have just been making the epiglottis. But he wanted to also say that no, the placement of the windpipe itself was a decision nature made theologically. So that's pushing it a little bit. All right. So a couple of concluding remarks. So for Aristotle, this craft analogy, as I mentioned, is a kind of heuristic. Like you think about nature in that way only to discover the causes. And then once you have the causes on the table, Aristotle thinks what you can do is like produce these syllogisms. You get dry science out of it. You don't need any of that metaphor. You don't need any of the intentionality. You don't need any of the goal directedness. What you get is just predicates. And you can put functions in the predicate position, and that will do all the work for you. What it does give us insight to, I think, that there are for Aristotle multiples of modes of causation going on here. So you have the top-down type of causation where stuff follows directly from what is already in the form versus things that are more bottom-up, like given that there are extra matter available, function emerges from that. So there's no contradiction, I don't think, for Aristotle between teleology and material necessity. Sometimes they go hand in hand. It allows him to distinguish between giving a story for why things came to be and why things are present, and those things might be different. So not everything that is present for a function came to be for a function. The eyebrow just oozed out, but now it's there because it doesn't have. And I think it allows him to explain, so there's the variations that he sees across species. Right, so again, I think for Plato, maybe what you have is the form of a bird, and then when you ask Plato, why does the chicken have such short legs, and why does the flamingo have tall legs, Plato would have to say something, well, the materials that were used for this bird came with more leg materials or something like that. Whereas Aristotle can actually say something about how the animal was adapted to its specific way of life, its particular environment, by having more room, like with what is given by the form and what you can do with extra materials. And it also allows him to explain suboptimal results teleologically, right? So it's not anything that's not perfectly teleological. It's not because the material was imperfect. It can be because nature still did the best it could, but had other constraints to work with. So that is what I like about the picture. A couple of questions that still remain So the role of what Aristotle calls bios, so this term both captures the animal's way of life and its environment. So it's like, the salmon's way of life that starts off in the creek or something like that, and then involves going out to the sea and then swimming back up the riverbed. And there's a bit of a question, like how does that work? Like what does it mean for the environment itself to be part of the definition of an animal? And so to what extent is that sort of very vaguely given? Could it be just like living in salt water versus sweet water? And then the material necessity of the environment itself makes all the adjustments, imposes changes on the animal once it's already born. I'm not quite sure yet how that works out. So my grad student, Aurora Yu, is working on some of these questions. And that issue sort of relates to another big one that I think Plato has a better handle on than Aristotle. And that has to do with trying to explain why it is that even if you have an internal nature that sort of is doing the best it can for that species, so sitting there at its desk, building one animal at a time, given the specifications it has, that you then end up with a universe on Earth with a perfect, ecosystem in which all of these animals are able to survive eternally, right? So I didn't include the dolphin example, for instance, but Aristotle says something about the dolphin was like, well, the dolphin has a very weird snout. The beak is sort of placed on the underside instead of in the normal position, and that's because nature wanted to force dolphins to swim upside down to catch fish. It's really, Aristotle must have observed so many dolphins. Why he got that wrong, unclear. But the explanation is that nature wanted to make sure that the small fish that the dolphin was catching had a chance to escape. And because a dolphin is a glutton and it would eat itself to death. So this is a kind of teleological correlation of different species. So how do you explain that? And so my grad student wants to say there must be a kind of nature of the whole, there must be underlying nature. So what does this teleological coordination is not this individual nature sitting at its desk. It's somebody from higher up calling all the shots and who already made sure that all this stuff on the table of the individual designers already fitted together. And so in Plato, you have the form of animal itself that might do that kind of work. And I don't know, so my answer would have to be something like, well, chance, external material necessity. I might think a bit more about fields. But if you think of the whole world as a kind of thing in itself that puts constraints on the individual species that might go some ways in answering that question, I'm not quite sure. And then the big question is sort of that I mentioned earlier, is how to cash out this craft analogy. So how to get to the bottom of what kind of causation Aristotle actually has in mind. How does teleology work without having final causes, pulling from the future to the front? So all we get is this language of potentials for form being realized. And then how Aristotle describes it, well, once the first potential gets actualized, it's like this series of automatic puppets, it's like so if the process itself is blind, how does it happen that if extra materials show up, some cases nature then adds hair on top of the head, in other cases adds length to the legs, right? So it's not clear, are we thinking of these potentials for form themselves, dynamic, complex? Yeah. So this is pessimistic. This is where I gave up. In Aristotle's teleology, it's like I cannot go any level lower because it's just not clear how that works. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, so there's the one where the horns just keep growing, and like the animal impales itself if it doesn't like rub its horns often enough. Not cool. Yeah. What's it called? You know, the species or? I'm not sure what it is. Yeah. GPT. Something I've been like a little. I've been like trying to think about when it comes to when mistakes are made in nature or something. It seems like the talk is usually like binary, like oh it's useful or not. But like obviously with shift, but useful. Kind of like when you're going between like breakfast and lunch and you have no idea what you're actually gonna eat. It's just right. But it doesn't mean you don't. It doesn't like end up fine or good in the end. So is there any foundation kind of like transitional? Yeah. I mean, Aristotle clearly has something in mind with it. Well, it's harmful for the males that have these horns. They're not quite useful, but not harmful enough to get rid of them, as nature does in the case of the females. I don't know. I'm also asking just like the youth. I only know baby biology.
Thank you. That was great. Nikki from before,
yeah.
we a reading group, and this semester we're doing a history of teleology, and we started with your book, and it was great. And in that group, there's a Aristotle scholar who emphasized when explaining teleology to all of us, for Aristotle, the role of chance, and how there's actually two definitions of chance. And you acknowledge this in the book. It's not like a gotcha.
Yeah.
You talk about it, but as you mentioned chance a few times here, and I was wondering if you could talk about the two kinds and if they're relevant. I think it was spontaneity chance or something like that.
Yeah, so one is at the realm of nature, and the other one is on the realm of human action. And so in both cases, they work in terms of counterfactuals, like they're things that could have happened for the sake of something, but in this case didn't. Like if I walk below a building and I get hit on the head by a planter or something, it could be because one of my former students was trying to take me out before finals, or it just happened by accident, something like that. And yeah, so I mean, for me, chance mainly construct Aristotle's teleology in opposition to material necessity and conditional necessity, obviously, but that's sort of the standard story. Chance more has to come in for me at the very end. So what I was talking about in my conclusion, like how do you account for everything coming together so beautifully? There, like, if someone like me who does not want to go, like there's a nature of the whole universe route or global teleology, but I say, well, it's by chance or by material necessity, like lucky, like that. But yeah.
So when you mentioned Aristotle's people, or and this kind of nature just put everything such as organs on the table and speaking of the useful ones, is that right?
Sort of, yeah. I mean, so the thought experiment is like how do you design an animal? And so Aristotle says, well, nature can pick all the parts. Nature does what is best from among the possibilities. And so what is possibility mean in that case? Well, the ontological possibilities of the parts that in fact have been realized by nature in a particular animal. Right? So if nature's creating humans and thinking about vision, like maybe it would have been better for humans to have telescopic vision or something like that, or like, but those are not on the table. That's sort of the idea. And so so there's this case where Aristotle asks, like, why do only humans have hands and all other four-footed land dwellers have feet, like just paws? And then the idea is like, well, you have both paws and hands on your desk, but you only give the hands to those animals able to use them, which turn out to be only humans. And then you give the paws to the cat.
Find that we have the essence or the plan of the organism first, and then we have the generation of organism.
Yeah, I mean, so this, I'm not sure if I'm understanding your question correctly, but there is a sort of circularity in the system, in which you look at birds as they exist, and then you say, oh, they all have wings. Oh, they're all flyers. Therefore, all birds must be essentially flyers. And then you go back downward. But that explains. I mean, I think for Aristotle, that's like, well, now I can explain why even chicken have wings, even though they're terrible flyers. They don't need flying for survival. Yeah.
Function.
No, he thinks so. They're structurally analogous. I mean, so they come out differently, but like if you make a flyer, you need wings. Clearly, what wings look like in insects and birds are different, but what you need are wings. And the things are, in both cases, you call them wings, even if structurally speaking and materially they're made out of different things.
But sometimes you have different kinds of organs, just like hog have the teeth, and maybe other cows, but they all have the function for different people.
Yeah. So protection, on my account, is a secondary function. So it's not part of the essence. It's an add-on feature. In the same way that Plato says, like the first humans, the only reason why they were given nails is because some of them reincarnate as women and animals, and then they need nails. But truly, the design of human did not need nails. And there are often parts like hair, you can cut it, shave it.
Okay, well, this is like so awesome. First of all, thanks so much. So I think I understand what's going on if we were to take this like craftsman metaphor literally, right? Yeah. Okay, I've got my two rule books, I've got all these parts, and I've got to kind of satisfy everyone as best as possible as far as the books are concerned. Okay, but I'm still struggling to see like what's literally happening for Aristotle, such that this is a metaphor for that. Is something about like the organization of the parts. I wonder, can you like try and cash out Aristotle's metaphor in a little more detail?
I can try. Oh my God. So this is the hard question, right? So in the clearest account we get, I think it's in Generation of Animals 2:6, where Aristotle explains embryogenesis. So like he thinks there are various phases or stages. So first round, nature makes the things that are most important, like the heart. Next stage, nature makes the things that assist the heart, like other parts that are important. And then the later stages can happen during embryogenesis, but also later. Like most babies, thankfully, are not born with teeth or hair, for instance. So clearly, there's a kind of prioritization of like what needs to be made first, and what needs to be made from the best materials. And that's where Aristotle uses kind of thought, that nature is a good housekeeper. First feeds the free people, then the kids, then the slaves, then the animals. And so you get a similar kind of hierarchy in terms of parts. And I think deeper down, I don't know, because all you have is potentials for form, right? And I don't know how it is that some potentials for form get prioritized, get to be realized first, and others second, and others third, and others have to wait until much later. Aristotle does not really give, he just always resorts to this kind of metaphor of nature, formal nature, or the soul of an animal acting as a craftsman, using heat and pneuma as its tools.
So there's no hint of where the teleology comes from in what we would call physical terms.
Yeah. You get the potentials, right? So the potentials themselves are kind of teleological concept.
But by demand of Aristotle that you make it physical, he's going to go, what? Okay.
Yeah.
Hey, Nicole, online.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, perfect. Thank you. That was a wonderful presentation. I have a question kind of similar to the previous one. I'm just wondering, so there seems to be a lot of sort of solutions that Aristotle proposed that nature used, like removing the horns because they're useless or adding a different method of protection or like doctoring it. Did he suggest any principles that nature follows in different cases? Because I mean, would he think it's conceivable that rather than removing the horns on female deer, nature could have just, I don't know, like put cotton candy tips on them so they wouldn't hurt themselves or hurt others or something like that, Like, did he have any principles he outlined for what solution nature did for its mistakes?
No, I mean, that's an excellent question. So I think it's clear that Aristotle thinks that there's some things that nature simply cannot doctor with, like cannot be adjusted, like the snake, right? One simple solution would have been to just shrink the damn thing, make it shorter, and then feet would have fit it. Nature cannot do that. Same with the elephant. Like the elephant needs this long trunk as a kind of diving, like a snorkel equipment, because it has to find its food in water. Because it's so big, it's so slow that it would drown if it had to. And so you think, well, why not shrink the elephant and then it could just swim in quickly and come back out? So nature cannot do that. And I think the main constraint is that Aristotle's working with the actual animal as we have it in front of us. Right, so the actual female deer don't have these soft things on their horns. Actual female deer have not been made bigger, so they could carry the weight of the horns better. And so I think what Theophrastus says in some of these cases, Aristotle should have just given up and not tried to give an teleological explanation of it. And I mean, the cases I've given you are the extremist ones. I mean, they're not a huge amount of them, but they do put pressure, I think, on Aristotle's system. But exactly by making it clear that it's kind of arbitrary, his explanations definitely sound ad hoc in these cases.
Question. Oh, sorry.
No.
Are you sure?
Go ahead.
So, in the Phil bio literature, which I'm not sure how much you follow, there is a camp of neo-Aristotelians, generally articulated, who offer rehabilitated notions of a kind of Aristotelian account of what we find in modern biology in one flavor or another. Christopher Austin is somebody that comes to mind. David Oderberg does some things. So I'm just curious, and I don't think to answer this question, you wouldn't necessarily need to be familiar with any of these particular accounts. But I'm just curious, in your view, how much and to what extent do you think it's possible to rehabilitate Aristotelian teleology that matches up with modern biological practice? Post-Darwinian and I mean even in a more contemporary sense.
Yeah.
Post-McJay.
I think even on my account of Aristotle's teleology, like I think my account is pretty radical in that in one part of the book where it talks about the ultimate syllogism that captures teleology, I don't think functions or final causes can be the middle term. So I don't think final causes ever do any backward causation. The only reason that works is because they're the final causation and formal causation and efficient causation collapse. Right? It's like when you get like your Lego instructions, right? It's not that the finished product pulls you from the future back forward. It's because the structure that's given to you leads up to a certain point that you then call the final cause. So I think my understanding of Aristotle's teleology in a way is already it's a bit, yeah.
So it's not time reversed.
No.
Yeah, I think that was
Well, that is
one of the most great insight I garnered from your book.
Well, that's like the one thing where people are like, okay, we'll buy the secondary teleology, whatever, but like the stuff I say about the posterior analytics are like, that's crazy.
Continuing the same question, there's a view may be derived from Aristotle, I don't know, in 19th century pre-Darwinian biology, especially of the developmental biologist Carl von Baer, that development moves from the general to the specific, that a body plan is laid out, and once the body plan is in place, these pre-Darwinian, no selection, no functionalism or anything, it's the idea of the rat that's coming to be in development. Once it's laid out and we've got an axial something and a globby something and couple prongs for them coming out the side, we've now made some commitments. The next step is going to be, well, what's next as development? It's going to be, put fingers on those arms, add flesh around the column, right? Build out the head, eyes are going to be, but it's always building down from the general to the specific. Can we translate that into, is this going to be a forced move, translating that into Aristotle?
No, but I think what it captures is his explanatory practice. So what he tries to do, like in the history of animals too, like he doesn't want to go through and describe every individual animal one by one. He always wants to capture things at the most general level possible. And so he does these sweeping things like, like he talks about the crocodiles having a fish life. It doesn't mean that it's actually a fish, but that's a shorthand for like a bunch of other stuff. So I think that model fits with the way Aristotle tries to explain the things that he sees, but I don't think it captures the causality because there is no form of fish. It doesn't exist.
In Aristotle?
In Aristotle.
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
the thing that exists is the form of the goldfish, and the form of the shark, and the form of the the form of the salmon. There's nothing like the thing about souls, right? Like the anima. It's like speaking in outline, but there is no soul creates soul. There's only the love soul and the.
And 19th century biology was idealist to the point where they thought the idea was primary and pre-existed and so forth. Whereas Aristotle's an epigeneticist, which has this happening in not just in a species, but in every iteration. Every individual is going through the same discovery of who you're going to be.
Yeah. So there are abstractions that help us to explain the quickest and most efficient and the universal level what's going on, but they don't capture the the way the animal speak.
One other point of difference, which you can answer quickly, I think. You talked in functional terms. This is going to be a swimming animal. This is going to be a land animal. It's a decision made early on. That's a functional decision that's being made. The idealists were thinking purely in structural terms. The idea is coming to be, it's manifesting itself. What it can do in the end, well, it's a perfect idea, so it'll be able to function. Function is an afterthought in this. Structure is what's central to it. Is function central to Aristotle, or would he not make the structure-function distinction and say, yeah, it's both?
Well, it is both, but what determines the structure, like it's the function that tells us what the structure is. If that makes sense.
So function first. Okay. And that makes it quasi-Darwinian.
Yeah.
Minus natural selection.
Yeah, so there was some talk earlier today about, I think my Aristotle would be ecstatic about discovering DNA and like throw away form and all of that stuff, but the same ideas but still think you would, and like who cares about metaphysics? Well, I say that. I mean, I'm like let's preserve what is good about his biology and throw out the bad metaphysics. Preserve the metaphysics because
I love the idea that somebody thousands of years ago got it basically right. And you have to be careful with the word basically because a whole bunch of it is not.
What I like about it is that he was such a careful observer, and he did see like nuance and like appreciated variation, and then that's even though you made some really weird mistakes.
I have one more question, if I can indulge. Okay. And I was actually asking Mo about this on the ride back here. So passage, and of course it's a famous passage in physics 2 with the question of brain.
Yeah.
And I've read your interpretation, and I don't find it compelling. So my read of this, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with this passage. It's a strange passage over which there's lots of lots of scholarship. But so I'm just wondering if you think that this is at all plausible, because here's my read of it. So you have him trying to knock down Empedocles, and he has the example of teeth. So you have chance with Empedocles. That's not compelling at all. Points at ordering of teeth in the mouth as evidence of this. This would not happen by chance. Therefore, the Empedocles version of things can't be right. Then you get the rain, and it seems like this non sequitur of what's going on here. And as a plausible read of this, and then I want your actual read, which is certainly the correct one.
Tell the rain story to the.
Oh, well, I'll leave that to expert. I don't want to get that. Or the question is something like the rain also guided by teleological principles, in most general terms. So it seems like one way you might read this would be that Aristotle would say that the Empedoclean comeback here is that rain seems very random. And on any given day, you don't know if it's going to rain or not. Therefore, Empedocles says I'm right. But Aristotle comes back and says, yet the seasons, right? If you average it out, I still can tell a story about how rain has a teleological quality. But correct me here, because that would be my reading.
Yeah, so I think rain itself is not teleological. Because rain does not have a nature. Individual water elements do have natures. Their nature is to go down, not necessarily to produce rain. So in that context, so this is the only passage where Aristotle defends teleology, or seems to defend it, but it's a really bad argument. So he says, well, if you have rainfall that happens regularly in the winter and that produces crops, that must be, you have a regular natural phenomenon that has a regular good outcome. Shouldn't we explain that teleologically, as opposed to having rain that trashes crops or something like that? And then the parallel case is teeth that come to be at the time that they do, the shape that they do, and then help cutting. And then the next level would be animal parts. So animal parts. And so like on my reading, you get sort of the a fortiori reading with like the very weakest case we connect with a process that happens of material necessity that gets used or co-opted by humans to help them grow their crops, to a process that pertains to secondary teleology because it involves teeth, and then a process that pertains to primary teleology. But I have to admit, like the way I wrote the book is backwards. Like I was not going to write about the whole physics stuff. It has so much, there's so much written about it. And I definitely feel like I doctored the interpretation. I mean, I think that's sort of what you have to do. Once you figure out your reading of teleology, then you make sense of that passage, because the passage itself is so problematic and underdetermined. It seems to play on sort of the mythological explanation of rain, like Zeus reigns, like that's even preserved as part of the explanation. Surely that cannot be teleological. So it's like, like placing providential mythological paradigms slowly but surely by a biological strong teleology thing. Not his best day.
I'm happy with that. I'm happy with that interpretation.
Read the parts of animals.
Any other questions? Then let's take